1492 1 year. 3 decisions. Each one changed the world in a different direction. The first decision. On January 2nd, the last Muslim king of Granada descended from the Alhambra and handed over the keys to his city. 781 years after the first Arab armies crossed from Africa into Iberia, the last Islamic kingdom on the peninsula was gone. Isabel and Fernando entered Granada in triumph. The Reconquista, the longest military campaign in European history, was complete. The second decision. On March 31st, in the same Alhambra that had been surrendered 11 weeks earlier, Isabel and Fernando signed the Edict of Granada. Every Jew in Spain, somewhere between 100,000 and 160,000 people, a community that had been present on the Iberian Peninsula for 1,500 years, longer than Christianity itself had existed in the region, had 4 months to choose between baptism and exile. Those who left could take nothing of value. No gold, no silver, no horses. The third decision came in April, when a Genoese sailor who had been waiting years for this answer finally received it. Isabel and Fernando agreed to fund his expedition westward into the unknown Atlantic. He sailed in August. He made landfall in October. 3 decisions. The fall of Granada. The expulsion of the Jews. The discovery of America. All in the same year. All signed by the same hand. What kind of person does all 3 things in 12 months? What does it tell us about the mind behind them? And why does the most extraordinary year in Spanish history begin not in 1492 but 12 years earlier, in the dark machinery of an institution that most people would rather not think about too carefully? The answer starts in Seville. In 1480. In a fire. In 1492 Isabel I signed 3 documents that between them ended a medieval world and began a modern one. But the machinery that made 1492 possible was built across the previous 12 years, quietly, systematically, by a woman who understood that order required instruments, and that instruments have a logic of their own once set in motion. Subscribe, like the video, and let's go through every piece of it. Before the Inquisition. Before Granada. Before Cologne. The first thing Isabel built when the war was over was not a cathedral. It was a police force. The Santa Hermandad, the Holy Brotherhood, was established in 1476, during the war when the roads of Castile were effectively ungovernable. Brigands controlled the routes between cities. Merchants traveled armed or didn't travel at all. The justice system that was supposed to address this was fragmented, corrupt, and slow. Local courts controlled by local nobles who had their own interests to protect and no particular incentive to protect anyone else's. Isabel's solution was characteristically modern in its conception and medieval in its execution. She created a standing force of mounted police, funded by a tax on each city and town proportional to its population, with jurisdiction that crossed noble boundaries, with authority that came directly from the crown, and with a specific mandate: maintain order on the roads. The penalty structure was designed to be unambiguous. Serious crimes, robbery, murder, arson, were punishable by death, carried out by the Hermandad itself without referral to the local courts that might be bribed or intimidated into inaction. It worked. Within a decade the roads of Castile were measurably safer than they had been in living memory. The merchants who had been arming themselves for travel began doing something more profitable with the money they had been spending on guards. The tax revenues that funded the state began to flow with a regularity that the previous reign had never achieved. Fernando del Pulgar, Isabel's chronicler, recorded the transformation in terms that make clear how dramatic it was. Where previously a journey between Castile's major cities was a calculation of risk, within a few years it became a matter of route planning. The roads were safe. That sounds like a small thing until you understand what it meant for commerce, for communication, for the administrative coherence of a kingdom that had been too fragmented to govern itself. The Santa Hermandad was, in modern terms, a state-building exercise. It was Isabel asserting that the crown's authority extended to the roads between cities, not just the cities themselves. It was the first systematic erosion of the noble privilege that had made Castile ungovernable under Enrique IV. It was also the template. Because what the Hermandad demonstrated was that a centralized institution, funded uniformly, operating with consistent rules across noble boundaries, could produce results that the fragmented local system never could. The lesson would be applied again, in a different context, with considerably more fire. Seville. 1477. Isabel was in the city for an extended administrative visit, working through the governance of Andalusia, which had been in a state of near-permanent disorder and was going to require sustained personal attention to fix. She received a visit from Alonso de Ojeda, the Dominican prior of the convent of San Pablo, who had been compiling evidence for years about a specific problem that he believed required royal intervention. The problem was the conversos. Conversos, converted Jews and their descendants, had been a feature of Spanish society since the mass conversions of 1391, when anti-Jewish violence across the peninsula had forced hundreds of thousands of Jews to choose between baptism and death. Many had converted sincerely. Many had not. The ones who had not, the crypto-Jews, the secret practitioners of a faith they had publicly abandoned, were, in the theological and legal framework of 15th century Castile, heretics. They had accepted baptism. They were therefore Christian. And a Christian who privately practiced another faith was committing a crime against the church and the state simultaneously. The Inquisition was not invented by Isabel. Inquisitorial tribunals had existed in Catholic Europe since the 13th century, designed specifically to investigate and prosecute heresy. What Isabel did was request from Pope Sixtus IV the authority to establish an inquisition that operated under the direct control of the Spanish crown rather than under papal authority, an institution that was, structurally, as much a political instrument as a theological one. The papal bull authorizing the Spanish Inquisition was issued on November 1, 1478. The first auto de fe, the public ceremony of judgment and punishment, was held in Seville on February 6, 1481. 6 people were burned alive. The machine had started. In 1483, Pope Innocent VIII appointed Tomás de Torquemada as Inquisitor General of the Spanish territories. Torquemada was Isabel's confessor. She trusted him. She had specifically requested him for the position. He was, by every account that survives, completely sincere in his conviction that what he was doing was necessary, that the alternative to rooting out crypto-Judaism was the corruption of the Christian faith in Spain, and that the corruption of the Christian faith was an outcome worse than the methods required to prevent it. Torquemada was also, by those same accounts, a man whose sincerity had burned through the normal human capacity for restraint that keeps institutional power from becoming institutional cruelty. He did not eat meat. He did not sleep on linen. He wore simple robes and rejected the Archbishopric of Seville when it was offered to him because he considered personal wealth incompatible with his vocation. By the standards of 15th century ecclesiastical office, he was a man of extraordinary personal austerity. He was also, in the word that his name became synonymous with for the next 5 centuries, a symbol of the particular horror that righteousness produces when it is given institutional power and no effective check. How much of what the Inquisition became was what Isabel intended? This is the question that historians have been arguing since the 16th century, and the honest answer is that the evidence does not resolve it cleanly. She wanted an institution that would identify and prosecute false converts. She got that. She did not want, by the evidence of her own interventions, an institution that operated entirely beyond any control. She complained multiple times to Torquemada about specific excesses, intervened in specific cases, attempted at various points to limit the scope of the investigations. But the instrument had its own logic. And once set in motion, it was very difficult to stop. The war against Granada lasted 10 years. It was not a single campaign. It was a decade of sieges: Zahara, Alhama, Loya, Ronda, Malaga, Almeria, Baza, each city its own chapter in the systematic reduction of the last Islamic kingdom in Western Europe. It was the most expensive military operation of Isabel and Fernando's reign, funded by the church silver she had taken during the Succession War, by papal crusade taxes, by the general revenues of a kingdom that was beginning, slowly, to recover from decades of disorder. Isabel followed the army. This is not a metaphor. She was present at the campaigns. She organized the supply lines. She received ambassadors in the field. She gave birth to her daughter Catalina, later Catherine of Aragon, later Henry VIII's first wife, later the woman whose marriage Henry VIII would try to annul in an act that split English Christianity, in a camp near the siege of Alcalá la Real in 1485. She was 34 years old. She had been on campaign for 3 years. She was giving birth in a military encampment and would continue the campaign afterward. The fall of Granada was not unexpected. By 1491 the city was besieged, isolated, its food supplies exhausted, its last military option gone. The negotiations between the last Nasrid King Boabdil and the Castilian Aragonese commanders had been ongoing for months. The surrender terms, which were considerably more generous than those typically offered to a conquered Muslim city, guaranteed the safety of the Muslim population, the protection of their property and their mosques, and the continuation of their laws and customs under the new administration. On January 2, 1492, Boabdil descended from the Alhambra. He handed over the keys to the city. Then, according to the legend that the sources preserve, though the sources themselves are later than the event and may be embellishing. He paused on the pass south of the city and looked back at the Alhambra one final time. His mother, the legend says, said something to him that translated into Castilian became the most quoted sentence in the history of the Reconquista. "You weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." Granada was the end of 781 years of history. But 11 weeks later came the decision that historians still argue about. The one that cannot be explained by military necessity or political calculation alone. The one that expelled 100,000 people from a country their families had lived in for 15 centuries. If you want to understand why, and why the answer is more complicated than either side of the debate usually admits, stay with me. March 31, 1492. The Edict of Granada was signed in the Alhambra, the same palace, the same rooms that had been the seat of the Nasrid kingdom 11 weeks earlier. The symmetry was probably not accidental. The edict gave the Jews of Spain 4 months to choose: convert to Christianity and remain, or leave, taking whatever they could carry that was not gold, silver, or horses. The reasoning in the document itself was specific. The proximity of practicing Jews to converso communities was identified as the primary cause of crypto-Judaism. As long as Jews were present, converted Jews would be tempted back toward the faith they had publicly abandoned. The solution to the converso problem, therefore, was to remove the source of temptation. This reasoning had been developed over years by the Inquisition. By Torquemada specifically, who had been arguing for expulsion as the logical conclusion of the institution's mandate since at least the late 1480s. The historians who have examined the internal documents of the Inquisition most carefully, Joseph Perez, Henry Kamen, Benzion Netanyahu, disagree significantly about the relative weight of theological conviction, political calculation, and institutional momentum in the final decision. What they agree on is that by March 1492, the decision had been building for at least a decade. What was Isabel's role, specifically? The edict was issued jointly by both monarchs. The version for Castile was signed by both. The version for Aragon was signed by Fernando alone, the legal distinction reflecting the different constitutional arrangements of the two crowns, not a difference in intent. Both monarchs owned the decision. But there is a story, reported by later sources and possibly legendary, but consistent with what we know of the personalities involved, that before the edict was finalized, Isaac Abravanel, the most prominent Jewish financier at the Castilian court, arranged an audience with the king and offered an enormous sum of money to reverse the decision. Fernando was listening. Then Torquemada appeared, uninvited, at the door of the chamber. He was holding a crucifix. He walked to the table, placed the crucifix before the king, and said, "Judas sold his master for 30 pieces of silver. Your Highness prepares to sell him for 300,000. Here he is, take him and sell him." Then he turned and left. Fernando signed the edict. Whether this story is true in its details is unverifiable. Whether it captures something true about the dynamics of the decision, about the relationship between the monarchs and Torquemada, about the limits of financial pragmatism in a court that had defined itself through religious conviction, is a different question. Most historians treat it as capturing something real even if the scene itself is embellished. 100,000 people at minimum left Spain in the summer of 1492. They went to Portugal, to North Africa, to the Ottoman Empire, to Italy. They went to places where they could be Jewish. The Sephardic diaspora, the communities of Spanish Jews that maintained their language and their culture across the Mediterranean and beyond, preserved Judeo-Spanish, Ladino, for 5 centuries after 1492. There are Ladino speakers alive today whose ancestors left Castile that summer. Isabel never publicly expressed regret about the edict. Whether she felt any is not recorded in any source that historians have been able to authenticate. The same spring, the same weeks, a Genoese sailor had been waiting in the orbit of the Castilian court for 6 years. Cristobal Colon, Christopher Columbus, had first presented his proposal in 1486. It had been reviewed by a royal commission, rejected, reviewed again, rejected again. The theoretical geography was disputed. The practical demands were considered excessive. He wanted ships, supplies, and titles, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy of whatever he discovered, that the Crown's advisors considered absurdly premature for a man who had not yet proven his theory correct. He was right and they were right. He was right that there was land across the Atlantic. He was wrong about how far it was. His calculations were based on a significant underestimate of the Earth's circumference, and if the Americas had not existed where they did, his ships would have run out of supplies before reaching Asia. The experts who rejected his proposal were rejecting it on reasonable grounds. The fact that he was ultimately correct was partly a matter of geography he didn't know about. In January 1492, with Granada just fallen and the court in the city celebrating the culmination of the Reconquista, Colón had been rejected one final time. He was leaving Castile. He had already made contact with the Portuguese court about trying again with Lisbon's backing. Then Luis de Santangel, the converso treasurer of the Aragonese crown, a man who understood the economics of exploration in specific and practical terms, went directly to Isabel and made the case one more time. The crown's financial exposure was minimal. The potential return was vast. The Portuguese were going to fund him if the Castilian crown didn't. The terms Colón was demanding were extraordinary only if he succeeded. If he failed, the titles meant nothing. Isabel listened. She sent a messenger after Colón, who had already left the city. The messenger caught him 2 miles down the road. He came back. On April 17, 1492, 17 days after the expulsion edict, the capitulations of Santa Fe were signed. The agreement gave Colón his ships, his supplies, and his titles. He sailed on August 3, 1492. 2 days after the last Jews of Spain were supposed to have left. The same ports that were processing the departure of 100,000 expelled people were also processing the departure of 3 ships heading west into the unknown Atlantic. October 12, 1492. Colón made landfall. The world that had existed before 1492, the world of the Reconquista, of a Castile bounded by the known Mediterranean, of a Spain whose relationship with the rest of humanity was organized around the conflicts and alliances of the European and North African systems. That world was over. 3 decisions. 1 year. 1 hand.